Late this afternoon, Israeli forces confirmed they have launched a major offensive against the Palestinian territory of Gaza, including midnight airstrikes. It has also confirmed shelling has started by troops massing along the border, but has walked back an earlier claim that forces are now operating inside the Gaza Strip.
A city under siege from above, and the death toll on the ground is mounting. This video has just been released by the Israeli Defence Force of their overnight offensive on what they say was an underground tunnel system. It's not being called a war yet, but propaganda is still a weapon. Both sides are now stepping up their attacks. Israel says 150 rockets have been fired by Hamas militants in the past 24 hours. Here, they're being intercepted by the Iron Dome missile defence.
Khalid Meshal, head of the Hamas Islamic resistance movement, described the current war between the resistance and the Zionist regime as a real intifada. This war is an exceptional war that has been waged in defense of Al-Aqsa Mosque, he said, adding, the Zionist regime will be eradicated. The Palestinian resistance has entered the battle against the Zionist regime in support of the occupied Quds and Al-Aqsa Mosque. The current war has begun for defending the sacred sites, he noted. The Palestinian resistance groups acted on the warning they had previously given to the Zionist regime and showed the high power of the resistance to this regime, Meshal highlighted. The Palestinian resistance movement Hamas had set a deadline for the Zionist military to leave Al-Aqsa Mosque by 6 o'clock local time Monday and free the Palestinians who have been arrested. Clashes between the Palestinian resistance and the Zionist regime began on Monday after the deadline expired.
A policeman was beaten to death in Democratic Republic of Congo on Thursday as rival Muslim groups clashed during Eid celebrations. Members of two opposing camps vying for leadership positions in Congo's Muslim community fought outside Kinshasa's Martyrs Stadium. They had planned to worship there together in a display of unity. Kinshasa Police Chief Silvano Kasongo said 3 civilians and 46 police were wounded. Videos on social media show a police officer being beaten over the head with blunt objects until he fell to the ground, after which his body was set on fire.
The US is still recovering from a hacking attack on oil pipeline operator Colonial that has caused rising prices and gas shortages in parts of the country. Now Friday sees news of another so-called ransomware attack. Japan's Toshiba says one of its units in Europe was targeted, and it's blaming DarkSide, the same group said to be behind the Colonial incident. French subsidiary Toshiba Tech Corp said it lost only a minimal amount of data on this occasion and no data leak had been detected. But it's the latest evidence of a growing wave of ransomware attacks. They see hackers encrypt data and demand money to decode it. Sometimes they also threaten to publish stolen data. Champagne maker Laurent Perrier is among other French firms to be targeted this year.
The coronavirus pandemic has reached the highest point on Earth, Mount Everest. Chinese authorities are planning to set up a barrier on the mountain's peak to prevent an outbreak in neighboring Nepal from crossing over into China.
Climbing from the south side and north side are different routes, so the chance of infection is low. The most important area is the peak, where we should focus on coronavirus prevention.
Mount Everest stands on the border between China and Nepal. Mountaineers ascend from both sides. A team of Chinese guides will be sent to the summit to create what's being called a line of separation to ensure distance is maintained between groups. It will cordon off the northern side of the peak, starting from one of the highest Tibetan camps at 8,300 meters. The move follows the discovery of a COVID-19 outbreak at the base camp in Nepal. At least 17 climbers were evacuated to the capital, Kathmandu, after becoming infected with the virus.
Well, the last thing we need with rising COVID infections is a strike in the healthcare sector. Gauteng's emergency medical services are accusing the health department of exploitation. They say they're overworked and underpaid. They've marched to the offices in Johannesburg to hand over a memorandum. They want payment for extra hours worked. The department has been given 2 weeks to respond. Otherwise, workers say ambulances will not respond to emergency calls.
Earthquake from 2 Southeast Asian countries was reported today in the afternoon. ANI reports, according to the National Center of Seismology, an earthquake of magnitude 6.6 on the Richter scale hit 642 km west-southwest of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. It occurred at tentatively 3:12 p.m. today. Minutes later, at around 12 p.m, an earthquake of the same intensity struck off the west coast of Indonesia, Sumatra as well. It hit the island called Nias, which is about 250 kilometers south of the city of Sinabang. According to the United States Geological Survey, the phenomenon triggered panic on the nearest island, but there were no immediate reports of damage or casualties.
Prince Harry has likened his upbringing to being in a zoo in a fresh attack on his family. The Duke of Sussex made the remark on a popular American podcast while discussing the effect royal life had on his health.
Prince Harry grew up in front of the cameras, in good times and in bad, but rarely has he been so open about an at times painful childhood.
If I've experienced some form of pain or suffering because of the pain or suffering that perhaps my father or my parents had suffered, I'm going to make sure that I break that cycle.
On the podcast, The Armchair Expert, the Duke of Sussex spoke about his mental health, his privilege and the challenges his father faced. The 36-year-old says growing up a royal is a mix between the Truman Show and being in a zoo.
After the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, Britain took control of the area known as Palestine, a strip of land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Back then, it was occupied by an Arab majority and a Jewish minority. The international community tasked Britain with setting up a, quote, national home for Jewish people in Palestine. But both the Jews and Arabs claimed that historical Palestine was their land. You can see how that will become an issue. From the 20s to the 40s, many Jewish people fled to Palestine to escape persecution and the atrocities of the Holocaust. But that only incited the Arab population living there. Violence between the Jews, Arabs and against the Brits escalated. So, in 1947, the United Nations voted for Palestine to be split into separate Jewish and Arab states. Jerusalem, a holy land for both, would become an international city. Jewish leaders embraced the plan, but the Arab leaders did not. So began a stalemate. In 1948, the Brits realised the problem couldn't be solved by them, so they left. And Jewish leaders declared the creation of the State of Israel, with the backing of then US President Harry Truman. This did not go down well with many Palestinians. A war broke out, with neighbouring Arab countries, including Jordan and Egypt, joining the fight, the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was catastrophic for Palestinians. Hundreds of thousands fled. By the time fighting ended the following year, Israel controlled most of the land. Jordan, siding with the Palestinians, occupied land which became known as the West Bank, while Egypt occupied Gaza. Jerusalem was divided between Israeli forces in the west and Jordanian forces in the east. Crucially, there was never a peace agreement. Each side blamed the other. War would continue for decades. Fast forward to June 5, 1967, the beginning of the Six-Day War. Now, this is significant because the map was again redrawn. Israel captured and occupied the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and other Arab territories. The thing is, most Palestinian refugees and their descendants live in Gaza and the West Bank. Neither they nor their descendants have been allowed by Israel to return to their homes. Israel says this would overwhelm the country and threaten its existence as a Jewish state. Now, Israel still occupies the West Bank, and even though it pulled out of Gaza, the UN still recognises that land as occupied territory. Following? Okay, now let's look at Jerusalem. It's one of the holiest lands on earth for Christians, Jews and Muslims. Israel claims the whole city as its capital, but Palestine claims East Jerusalem is the capital of its future state. For the past 50 years, Israel has built settlements in Jerusalem. More than 600,000 Jews now live there, but the Palestinians say that's illegal under international law. There have been numerous attempts at peace over the decades, starting in 1979 and culminating in the 90s in Oslo. Palestinian and Israeli leaders met and negotiated a two-state solution. Initial promise and optimism gave way to anger and distrust, and by 2000, violence again erupted. By 2008, the prospects of peace had taken a severe hit. The most recent peace plan came from Donald Trump in January 2020. Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu said it was, quote, deal of the century, but the Palestinians scoffed at it, saying it was one-sided. So, tensions remained incredibly high, particularly in East Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank. Since 2007, Gaza has been ruled by a Palestinian militant group called Hamas, which has battled Israel countless times. Palestinians say they're suffering because of Israeli actions and restrictions. Israel says it's only acting to protect itself from Palestinian violence. It is endless. But things really kicked off in mid-April 2021, the start of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan. There were daily, violent clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians. And scenes like this, forced eviction of Palestinian families in East Jerusalem, which inflamed the situation. And then this. Israel unleashed devastating airstrikes on Gaza, while Hamas countered with hundreds of rockets fired back at Israel. As has so often been the case, conflicting claims over Jerusalem is at the emotional core of this conflict. Egypt and other surrounding nations tried to broker peace, but as always, for peace to be agreed, both sides need to resolve complex, deep-seated issues. And until that happens, it's hard to see an end to this endless conflict.